Last time on Worlds Asunder.
Don't worry, we're just recording all of this.
Can I help you? You just heckle me more so it takes longer. We can do blooper reel. You're welcome.
Oh, yeah, no, this is definitely going in one of the outros.
Okay.
All right.
You're gonna do the intro and I'm gonna shoot that.
Yes. No.
I think we're good. You ready? Alright. Winks all around.
The stories we've read capture our attention and immerse our minds in settings of all kinds to bring us the spectrum of feelings and deliver the tale of tales to our starving psyches.
Whether it's medieval-style fantasy with mages and knights,
Or hard sci-fi takes on the future of space colonization.
or thrillers set in your backyard, world building is the foundation that holds up the narrative, the glue that keeps it from unraveling as readers follow the journey you laid out for them, all to make the stories jump from the pages and burn themselves into our memories.
Welcome, weary writers, to Book Career in a Year's network of podcasts. This is Worlds Asunder, an insightful podcast on world and character building.
My co-host is the one and only David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's the H.Y. Gregor, but you can call her Haley or Sour Patch, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
We know. We have nearly a score of published novels and short stories between us, but who the hell are we to teach you about world building and character development? We get it, which is why we decided to call in some favors.
Each week, we pull from a list of the best and brightest authors, editors, and publishers to give tips and guidance on tackling the age-old questions and provide you with tools on how to accomplish world building like the pros. From environment to magic to characters, how do we strike a balance between what matters to our audiences and what matters to keep it all straight? Open up your ear holes
And your minds.
and get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder.
So, if you're ready.
Just knock and enter.
So for urban fantasy settings specifically, when you talked about how you were drawing from your memories of driving through certain settings when you were younger, and you have had people say, oh, this gas station wasn't built until this year. Where is the line as far as how much research you do to try to get like setting accuracy for real world places?
Google Map is my friend.
Tools and trades.
I also really miss Google Earth.
Oh, because they're not different anymore, are they?
Right. Well, Google Earth kind of gave you almost like a 3D view. Mm-hmm. And so let's just say I spent enough time looking at Cheyenne Mountain that I'm probably on yet another list.
No, you're still on the same list. It was just, now you have two agents instead of one.
Agent Johnson and Special Agent Johnson.
Yeah.
I used to be able to see Cheyenne Mountain from my bedroom window in Colorado Springs. It was right there.
And actually, I had someone tell me that they actually had been like hiking on the path that was used by some of the characters up in there, like, you know how the paths go up in Colorado State Park? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or I think that's what it's called.
I think it's Cheyenne State Park is the one just north of the Army base.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's like, they're like, oh yeah, I've been on the trail that you talk about there.
So do you ever like interview people or talk to people who live in the settings, try to find that kind of thing to help?
No.
Would you recommend it?
If you have access to it, yes.
Okay.
Another reason why for a lot of stuff, I stuck to either areas that I could easily find access to or that I had experience with. For example, the side trip to Russia, I was able to follow every step on Google Earth.
That's cool. So you knew exactly where they were.
Yes, I knew exactly where they were, what road they had to cross.
Nice. And his side trip through Kansas, he definitely didn't go do that. Definitely used Google Earth.
I'm sure we've all driven through Kansas at some point in our life and regretted it.
Am I lost? No, this is Kansas. It's still in America.
It still keeps going.
3 days later, we're still in Kansas.
As I wear a Nebraska shirt over here.
It's just as bad. So one of the things that I know, so Google Earth, Google Maps, it can only get you so far also. So you can go into places where I know that I have done this where I used Google Earth to write a scene and then actually visited this site later and said, oh no, this place it's not big enough, right? I didn't have the scope. Do you have advice as to how much we should trust Google Earth? Or is it easier to be less specific about the places you're writing about?
If you're not certain, it's easier to be less specific.
Okay.
Now, for example, in one book, I have a spot in Northern Ireland. That was another Google Earth research. But again, I was able to like literally take the camera down the road to like the bar that Liam and Pixel go to. And in the area that Grianne first appears. Conveniently, I got to go to the Scottish Highlands to personally visit the kickoff for book 5.
Research, it's a write-off.
Research, that's a write-off, yeah. One thing though, I did find when doing real world locations is, and I didn't do this in the first book as much, but later books I adhere to pretty strictly, is avoiding most real world business names.
Dig into that a little more.
And so, for example, actually I refer to like Pizza Hut and Subway in book 1. And I think that's the last time I refer to a real business. I file off the serial numbers.
Do you do that for other things as well? Not just businesses, but if you're talking about a specific website or a brand, like a clothing brand, or are there other things that you need to worry about or consider when you're writing in that?
The general rule is if you're not being defamatory, you're probably okay. But it's easier if you have something you can make a convenient like analog. And for one thing, like if something goes wrong with that brand later after you've written the book, like there's some big scandal or they just like, disappear off the face of the earth.
Well, and there are certain legalities that involve lyrics and song titles and those kinds of things as well. So when you're trying to make real world comparisons, because in urban fantasy you have the leisure to do that, where in some science fiction or in traditional fantasy you don't, right?
Right.
But those are things that all kind of have to be thought through a little more.
Right. You have to be careful with that because you can run into copyright issues. And it varies. So I don't use any like lyrics. I think I reference one band by name, Here Come the Mummies. Oh, they're great. They're basically a horns and brass band that play dressed up as mummies.
I love that.
They're all session musicians who are under contract, can't appear on stage as themselves.
With their faces?
So they have to dress up to do it. And they actually, Peoria is one of the areas they tour in.
Cool. That's very Daft Punk with the obscured identities.
Yeah.
Or what's the other big band that does that? Hollywood Undead, I think.
Do they wear masks?
Yeah, it's one of those bands. I'm pretty sure it was Hollywood Undead. Yeah. They wear and it worked. It worked for them to be able to like change members.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
stuff, right?
On the Mummies, I know they rotate characters in and out, probably like depending on who has gigs, stuff like that.
Yeah. All I can think of though is that Scooby-Doo's about to bust out onto one of their shows, and all right, it was Mr. Jenkins, and then it's like they pull the wrong mask off. Anyway.
We digress. But with that, so urban fantasy, you have the luxury to do pop culture references and stuff. Do you avoid those similarly because you're worried about dating the book, or do you love adding those? What?
I like sneaking in Easter eggs.
Okay.
And actually, I kind of broke character for Liam because I had him use a Star Wars reference when he's really pop cultural illiterate, and he's a bit of a technological Luddite. But he did use these aren't the droids you're looking for, my boss?
Yeah. I remember that.
Speaking of him being a Luddite, you talked about how for world building, when you get into it, science fiction technology is your main focus, and it's magic for fantasy. But with urban fantasy, you have the integration of the two.
Right.
Right. So what kind of things did you look at for that when you were building your series? Because we've seen it done a lot of different ways in different urban fantasy.
Like for example, in Harry Potter, magic tends to make technology go wonky. Well, I didn't want to do that, and actually, there's times where I actually tie in magic and technology together. For example, when the Celestials communicate to people, like Lee, all of a sudden the news show changes and the newscasters are talking to him out of the TV.
Yes.
But also, I wanted to make Liam a bit technologically backwards because with any character, they need stuff they're not good at.
Right. Well, and then you even used it, you took it a step further, because just beyond the newscasters, you also have your data rights, right? So that was a really unique thing that combined several elements of the world, and I thought it was really interesting. Would you expand on kind of where that idea came from? And
Well, so if magic is gone from the world, how did Pixel and Enar get there? How are they able to move around without getting caught? Well, that means that there are infiltration missions. And as we know in modern day, it's kind of hard to get around without,
passports.
some sort of ID or something, some numbers.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, there has to be someone forging these IDs. Well, then it's like, well, okay, these have to be aspects of a trickster god or trickster figure.
Yes.
So in fact, the data rights are referred to as Loki and Gwydion. Now, those may just be handles,
Right.
but it conveys the idea.
I love that. Fairy handles for hacking. So are there other things like that you try to exploit that make it really unique, where you're taking, fantasy elements and plastering them on top of like the real world stuff? Other things that you look for specifically for ideas?
I'm trying to think if there's anything I've done as far as an interesting interaction. Oh yeah, well, there's a scene where a place that was magically secure gets infiltrated because someone drilled a hole in the wall to run a wire.
It's a loophole that no one thought about.
Exactly. They literally drilled a hole through their wards to run this cable, and so something came in through the cable.
So that's a really unique thing that you run into for this genre specifically.
Well, and I love that because it is very, again, coming back to the fact that your novels are very character-driven, right? And so it is that right there, when you're looking at kind of a world-building aspect, is a really brilliant way to show these characters primarily think in one sort of system and function. And if they're so used to magic, getting the thing done, or they're so worried about magic, they completely forgot about the old spy trick, right? Like, that to me is just another piece of that building around your character plot.
Well, and they're being directly impacted by the world in a totally unique way for the genre, and then they're forced to adapt to it.
Right.
Yeah.
It also goes back to you have to make sure that you don't make your magic, or in science fiction technology, infallible.
Yeah.
And that's probably a whole other, we could probably do a whole podcast on like power leveling and looking at that, which is not so much a world building thing, but
I'm sure we will at some point.
yeah.
If you want to see a power leveling podcast, let us know in the comments. Thanks.
Yeah, what is that? Get it in there. Because there are a lot of things. I mean, power leveling, you run into like environmental struggles, and that kind of ties into your magic, right? Where they interact sometimes with the weather.
Exactly.
And how does that go? Do you use actual weather patterns to determine some of those things, or point it out as an anomaly?
Yes. In fact, the scene with the tempest elemental, because in Illinois, weather tends to move a certain way, and then when all of a sudden it starts going backwards, like when a storm had just passed through, it's like, wait a minute, there's something hinky going on.
Yeah. Where do you start drawing, weather is one of those fun things, right? It is both environment and a plot device, and also can be a character. So when you came up with the, your Tempest Elemental, like where are you drawing that piece of world building from?
Well, weather has always had a kind of a supernatural aspect for ancient cultures. I mean, even like, as kids, you probably heard that like rain is angels crying. Mm-hmm. That's our modern version of it. Yeah. Whereas, in the old days, the storms were the fury of Thor or Zeus. And also, because I established that there are elementals and elemental spirits, then it's like, well, okay, if there's like wind spirits, why couldn't there be a storm spirit? And how could someone exploit that?
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because the way you described it, the only thing I can think of is the Hercules scene where they release the Titans and one of them's the spinning wind.
Oh yeah, the cyclone.
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, and the way you describe it is much more, right? It is all of the things, but that is like the immediate reaction is I go, oh yeah, it's the tornado that went through and is now moving weather wherever it wants. But
Okay, so for urban fantasy specifically, when it comes to people who are maybe newer authors who are trying to develop a world for their stories, do you have any, what would be like your top 2 do not do tips? Do you think that there are any like really common issues that people run into, or roadblocks that they hit?
Probably one of the things you have to get really careful about is when you involve any sort of contemporary religion. I mean, I've gotten some hate and 1-star reviews because people pick up the book, they read the back jacket, and they're like, "Oh, he hates Christians." When in fact, my publisher and my main beta reader for the first book were both Catholics. And in fact, there was like one line that got changed because my beta reader's like, this comes across, and she explained to me like, how someone would take it, and I was like, oh, okay, I could see that, and then I changed it.
So that fine line between making the world realistic so it's recognizable, but also not like...
That's why, for example, I'm very specific that the Avramites are not just all Christians. They're a specific like sect that's operating to uphold the Accords.
Well, and you also, this is totally tangential to that, but potentially relevant workarounds that you're looking at for things that maybe are a little more controversial. You have good guys, quote unquote, that are still part of the, the celestial camp.
Yes.
So you haven't totally, villainized the whole.
And that's important because, and even like, my antagonist, 2 of them I would say get at least, some sort of like redemption or closure at the end. At the end of the A Tangled Fate, my beta reader's like, okay, that scene with redacted made me cry.
In the hospital?
No, the other one.
Tangent again.
Yeah, tangent again. Yeah. Although the hospital is the other one I was talking about.
Okay. And I have really enjoyed reading these books, and so this is fun getting to just kind of interview Oz and pick his brain a little bit about how he's built it all. Because you've taken this huge, so really right now you've focused a lot on, and talked about Irish specifically, threw in a little bit of the Norse, but you have opened it up with the way that you've written the world for a huge amount of growth, right? And so not only do you have other aspects of the real world, like other places physically that people are going to be able to go and visit, but you've got all of this other mythology, the different corners of the world. So when you were originally building the world, how did you plan on addressing those things?
So I knew the mythologies I wanted to deal with, and I also knew that I wanted to leave plenty of space for other people to play. So I referred to 2 kinds of world building when you first start. Worm's eye, which means you start focused in close to your character or characters, and your players or readers only see as much as those characters see. Bird's eye is you're up above, and you take a much broader view. And so for this, I use a bird's eye view. So I wanted a big sandbox, but if I cover it with sandcastles, there's no room for anyone else to play. So in your book then, and this is world building for novices. So like I said, it's a great sort of starter, but every chapter it digs down into some of the things. So technology and magic, races and cultures, which we didn't touch on almost at all. But in urban fantasy, that's really cool because you have things that we're familiar with here, and then you have all of the varied, fae and creatures and which have all of their own cultures and things, and then they start integrating and trying to figure out how to interact with humans, in a totally different world. So we touched a little bit on politics and religion. We didn't hit so much. War and economics. You're trying to avoid some of that because of the genre. I do touch on both of those if you look at the whole challenge as a war.
But that's yours.
Right.
War with champions.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, I have like in my list of things that I've thought about is, okay, how would things like, if magic comes back to the world, how would that affect things like war? What if all of a sudden, different sides could field supernatural champions? What if those supernatural champions were different based on their source culture? That's it. So hint for someone out there, that is a very fertile potential playground.
So when you are building a new world,
Yes.
what kind of considerations should people be thinking about how it's going to impact the characters? How much should the world itself be shaping your characters, their relationships, and their interactions?
If you're describing stuff in the world, it should impact the characters or the story.
Okay.
Because even if they don't directly impact the character, they can like drive the general conflict, or create obstacles.
Do you have any advice? We talked a little bit about how sometimes, and partially probably people who do have a gaming background get so excited about building the world, talking about the magic system, the clothes, the cultures. When do you say this is enough and decide that you're ready to actually shift into drafting or outlining or your next step?
That is a very slippery rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Because world building is fun. And I've been guilty of like spending months working on a world, and it's like, okay, am I going to get around to writing in this or having someone play in it? There's one world that's referenced in here, my alt history spellpunk colonial America.
Coming soon from Three Ravens Press.
Well, a story, not a book yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Rob would probably skin me if I didn't give him first crack at it. So.
That's fair.
But that started off as a book idea, and I came up with the basics of the world, and I ended up with probably about 20 pages of notes in a notebook. And I'm like, oh, I'm never going to get around to writing this. I'm like, but I could flesh out the world by running it as a D&D gang. So that's what I did.
That's really cool.
And then as the players moved around the world and interacted with different stuff, that kind of forced me to okay, how does that impact this? How would characters feel about that? What's the history of this thing that I just wrote a paragraph about 2 years ago?
And where did I save that in my world Bible? Yeah. Control F. So with that, we talked a little bit, you said the difference between science fiction and urban fantasy is that sci-fi, you can make up a lot of things and there's less scrutiny. Do you feel the same way about the differences between urban fantasy and traditional fantasy? Or,
Yes.
Epic fantasy?
Yes. In fact, with epic fantasy or standard fantasy, however you want to call it, I think that's even easier than science fiction. Because there's depends on how much science you have in your science fiction. For example, in the Four Horsemen universe, the ships actually use relativistic thrust. So most ships can't go over 5 Gs because it'll splat the crew inside. We don't have artificial gravity in the 4HU because we're not shooting TV shows in it yet. So the characters can float around if a ship's not under thrust. And it also takes that comes into play in things like combat, medical issues.
The kind of along those lines. So, you said it's a little more difficult, and this, we'll probably dive into this a little more down the road too. But you came up with a couple different planes of existence, essentially, and I think you describe it maybe slightly differently, but. How did you go about, building out these 3 other kind of areas where beings can exist, and then how did you come up with essentially the Woldfords?
So there's always been, well, not always, but as far as the legends for the Shi and the Twa Danan, there's this always this concept of an underworld or otherworld. When they refer to fairy mounds in Ireland, those are the doorways to the fairy world.
Okay.
So that means there had to be another world, basically layered with ours. So since I knew that all the magical folk had to be exiled somewhere, that made sense. And having it physically mirror our world keeps it a bit grounded. I mean, if you're going to do a magical world, it should have rules. And okay, so for example, the Rocky Mountains in the Glasswald are in the same place as they are in our world, the Dunwald. The Mirkwald is more kind of a cross between dreamwalking and the astral plane, where I wanted somewhere to be able to, that people could spirit travel, and for spirits to dwell. And then when I came up with the idea for the Umbra and the Deep Umbra, those are, or maybe like just kind of extensions of the Mirkwold. So, and we see that dealt with in the books, where there's creatures from the Umbra, and someone gets threatened to get thrown into the Deep Umbra at one point, and they're described as the hungering darkness.
And so every, the basis, because there are all of those different worlds that you've built into Milesian, they all have their own sort of subcultures of, creatures and races that you run into. So, and that's, so like the Mirkwold or the Deep Umbra, obviously darker, scarier, don't go there without a light kind of a thing, don't go alone.
Right. See the Shadowlands over there, Simba? You must never go there.
Exactly.
And the idea, the basic concept behind them is that, we perceive our world as 3 dimensions, right? Mm-hmm. But, math postulates there's a lot more dimensions. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, what if there's other worlds that are just like one-dimensional notch off ours? Mm-hmm. That's also where I got the idea for things like elf pockets.
Which are,
so we see this is a common trope, like the modern example is anime. Mm-hmm. The interdimensional hammer, where, some character will reach into a bag and pull out this huge mallet that's twice as big as they are.
Unlimited bag of holding.
Exactly. And so I wanted a way for characters to be able to hold, transport, or hide stuff. And so I'm like, well, if we have all these different dimensions, and you can use magic, why couldn't you just use magic to kind of tuck something into an adjacent dimension?
Yeah. And it would have to be something that could follow you around.
Exactly. Well, there's 2 kinds of elf pockets. There's ones that are bound to a person, and ones that are bound to an object.
Well, and then that, you also took that a step further because it impacts travel, right? So they have ways to go other places that are sometimes a little bit faster.
Right, back to your question about wildfords. Mm-hmm. So I needed a way to get through, from world to world. Mm-hmm. And so the easy shortcut became, well, there has to be some sort of portal. And I may have been inspired by, I think it was Charles DeLint had something called the tween, where like they were like spaces like between, like if you went between trees or something like that. Yeah. And you knew the right magic, you could step from our world to the next, or step from one tween to another.
And is that the term that they use in Pern as well, when the dragons go between? Is that what it's called? Because they do something similar.
I'm not sure, I've never read Pern.
Okay.
It's been a long time.
I'm rereading it right now, and I should remember.
Our experts are upstairs right now. We can ask them.
Yeah.
The trade-off is I didn't want to make it too easy to use those, though, to like jaunt across the world. Mm-hmm. So crossing, when you cross a walled ford, normally, you appear in the same spot in that other world. Mm-hmm. But to jaunt to a different walled ford, you have to go to another world, and it takes a lot of magical energy. Mm-hmm. Like, we see, like, when Liam does it, it knocks him for a loop.
Yeah.
So you want to build things such that when the characters need them to be advantageous, it is, but also it can't just be...
It can't be a convenient crutch.
Yeah. Or at least at the time, maybe they don't know the weakness yet, but there is going to be a weakness eventually that somebody will exploit against them.
Right. Well, I mean, Liam didn't know what was going to happen the first time he jaunted.
Yeah.
So personally for you, when you're building a new world, what's your favorite aspect? Like your favorite point that you like to dig into?
Ooh, it depends on what I'm using it for, really.
So for writing?
For writing, it hinges on my inspiration. For example, obviously with the Milesian Accords, it was magic. For my spellpunk world, it was history. For some reason, I became fascinated with New Amsterdam. And I want monster hunters working out of New Amsterdam. How do I do that? Well, I'm gonna need for there to be magic. All right, well, how do I do that? Well,
No, I got nothing on that.
I got one more. Least favorite thing about world building, or the hardest thing?
keeping track of everything.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for that?
Yes.
Oh, we could plug. You have a way to help people keep
Yes,
track.
the checklist.
Yes. You want to tell us a little bit about this? Obviously, this is not going to be super easy to see, but we'll link things. In the back of this book, he has checklists for a couple of different genres, and it addresses all of the points. And it's a really good way, I think, to start tracking things.
But this is just a starting point. For example, there's still times where I have to go back and does Waldford have a hyphen?
Is it italicized? What are we capitalizing?
Exactly.
That sounds really familiar.
Well, there's not, so then there's naming conventions, style conventions.
Yeah, your style guide is a whole thing. And for a shared world, that's a particular,
Right.
that's particularly important because you have to put it all in your Bible and then send it out into the world.
To talk about something other than Milesian Accords, that's something I learned in spades with Rules of Engagement in the Four Horsemen universe.
Mm-hmm. Which is it's an RPG that Oz is working on for the Four Horsemen.
It's a Savage World source book for the Four Horsemen universe, but to have all the world stuff in there, because we want it, in addition to being a game book, to be a world like source book for fans that don't game.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So I had to go in, and we had like a world Bible, but it was written in like 2017.
I think Chris talked about it on the one that we did with it.
Yeah, there are now 94, almost 94 books in this series. So just a few things to remember.
Yeah, and there was some stuff that wasn't covered in it. So the authors, because not only are there a ton of books, there's a ton of authors. So some of them adhere to certain conventions, some didn't, and so I'm trying to collect and homogenize all that.
Authors are worse than cats.
Yes, we are.
If only because when cats are herded, they're like pseudo trying to do the right thing, but at the same time, maybe kind of like, well, this seems interesting. Authors are obstinate on purpose.
Or we'd rather take a nap than be productive.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anything else? Procrastitask.
Yeah, I had something right after that, but you brought up rules of engagement. One of the things that, Oz and I have in common is that we both kind of started out doing the gaming thing, the tabletop RPGs, before we got into writing. And so that we've discussed previously. If Oz will agree to come back on eventually, we will likely do another one of those to talk about some of those inspirations and how the world building is different.
And there's a lot of cool crossover there too.
Yeah. But the other thing that I was thinking of is the amount of times that I will shoot you questions. For those who don't know, and this podcast is going to come out late July, somewhere in August, and my book will have been out for 3 months. But my first novel in the 4HU will have come out, and I kept shooting Oz questions because I would shoot them to Chris and I would shoot them to Casey and Mark. And they'd be like, I don't know, ask Oz, because the Bible wouldn't answer a lot of it, but Oz had a lot of the answers.
Yeah, you've been collating it all, so which is not a small. How many words is that right now? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't know, but I have at least 3 chapters that are about 35,000 words each. And it's a 12-chapter book. Now, some of the chapters are going to be a lot smaller, but there's one chapter that deals with a bunch of the aliens that we have in the universe. There's one that deals with the history of the Galactic Union and the worlds and locations. Then there's the one that has all the rules for creating characters. So that has things like talking about the vows assessments, the MST track, and then more detail on a set of races that people can play. So that one I actually went into things like naming conventions, things like that. We have a chapter that has every mark and every block of Casper specced out.
Yeah.
Which are mech.
Yes, they're like combat armor suits. So yeah, those are some big honking chapters.
But
And we could delve into probably each of those individually in another episode. So one of the things I think in a lot of writing courses you see, they'll cover this episode is about character and this episode is about plot and this one is about world building and it's 45 minutes or an hour, or you go to a writing conference and you take a class or two. But world building in itself, we can do a whole episode just on aliens, right? Yeah. Like we could talk just about magic systems, and we have hopefully a really exciting guest to talk about magic systems because there's so much there. And I think that's part of why we're so excited, is to be able to dig into some of these things that people maybe don't think about necessarily as traditionally world building, but really like help flesh out and bring stories to life.
Yeah.
it's also a really cool way to get to hang out with our friends and talk the nerdy shit that we love talking about.
Yeah.
Right. Hashtag bring Osborne.
Yes.
That's right.
I do it every time. I'm very consistent.
You are.
There's one factory con I think I left with 35 beers.
You did. I was,
Brought 12, left with 35.
and they were all different.
somehow he had an elf pocket. I don't understand how he did it, but
So Imperial Russian Stout was last time, and this is very strange.
Voodoo Brewing. It's very tasty. Out of Meadville, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and I bought it in Virginia Beach. The bar there is excellent. So if anyone's in the area, Voodoo Brewing, not a sponsor, but maybe should be.
And only if you're 21 or older.
speaking of sponsors, if you own a brewery line and you also want to learn how to write and you don't mind sponsoring our podcast, feel free to hit us up. We'll talk.
Or bring Oz beer.
So fun fact, the beer that Liam's favorite beer, the harder stout, is based on a friend of mine who brews beer, as opposed to me using like a real world brand.
So it's a personal experience touch there.
In fact, I do that for a lot of stuff that I'll Easter egg in people I knew, like a friend of mine who we were college roommates, and we worked at Domino's Pizza together. One of the pizza places is named after him.
Oh, cool. Okay. They eat pizza a lot in those books. Milesian Accords always makes me hungry. Which is world building.
If anyone reads the books, you're gonna like, gosh, this guy's like a hungry alcoholic. He's always writing about eating and drinking.
Oz really likes to eat.
Well, yeah, this is obvious.
I mean, it's not me writing the books, but I am also one of those, so Although I choose the words alcohol connoisseur.
Yes.
Yeah. Alcoholic would be admitting that I have a problem.
This is going to be on the internet.
Never. Authors are sometimes drinkers with writing problems.
Yeah.
Totally.
We can blame Ernest Hemingway. People latched onto that quote and write drunk, edit sober. Doesn't work.
Yeah.
No.
You got anything further?
I think we're pretty close to wrapping up here. Is there anything else specific that you would recommend that we touch on in the future, or things that for new authors you would say that they should pay close attention to when they're starting to do this process?
The big thing is just don't get sunk into the world building trap, because again, it's so much fun. And don't spend a lot of time on things that your readers or players are never going to see. If where the source of the blue dye comes from for the royal toga doesn't matter to the story or the characters, the readers don't need to know about it, and you don't need to spend 10 hours on the internet researching how to make blue dye in the 1st century AD.
I knew I was making a mistake.
Yeah. And I'm going to point out that by the time this episode airs, you will have probably heard a statement similar to that in almost every episode we've done.
Yeah.
So if it isn't stuck yet, listen this time.
It's all so much fun, and it can be one of the most exciting things, especially if you're writing genre, spec fiction, science fiction and fantasy. We fall in love with those worlds, right? We read about the Shire, we go to Middle Earth, or we look at, the cool stuff like the magical ceiling in Harry Potter, and it's those little things that make us want to be more involved in writing in general, and it's so easy to get lost in it. So this has been a super excellent episode for us. By the time this comes out, I may or may not have an announcement. Shady and I have both had the honor recently to work with Oz in writing some things in the Milesian Accords universe. And so we're intimately familiar at this point with the Bible and a lot of the things that he's been dealing with. I've been sending him millions of questions all the time asking, and he really knows his stuff. So I can't recommend enough. Come check out World Building for Novices. Go to his website. Sign up for his newsletter.
The Amazon link for the book.
Yes. Yeah, we'll make sure it's all available to you because they're great resources. And Jon really knows what he's talking about. He's got a ton of experience. So.
Yeah, so as we wrap up the show here, we'd like to thank, again, Nick Thacker and Book Career in a Year and the Book Career in a Year Network for allowing us to continue to host this podcast. If you're enjoying it, please let us know. If you're not enjoying it, please let us know as well so we can do some stuff to change it. Again, we apologize if we're a little more mellowed out or if some of our tangents are worse than normal because it's the end of a long con weekend and my brain, and I'm sure my two friends here are also fried. So if some of the jokes don't land, we'll just chop it up to con jokes and move on.
We think we're funny.
Yeah, at least I think I'm funny in this moment, and then I'll watch it back 3 or 4 days from now when I'm editing it, and I won't be near as entertained by the joke.
We're funny in another world.
There you go.
We've learned tonight that there are lots of options for that.
Yeah, there are plenty. I just got to toss this joke across the gap between worlds, and it'll land. Yeah. So I've been your host or co-host, David Shadoin. You can find me at davidshadoin.com, and I've kind of mentioned it, but one of the cool things that we had come out, what is this weekend, but by the time this podcast comes out is 4 months ago, is the anthology Paladins of Valor, where we have, all three of us have a Milesian Accords story coming out in that anthology, and I'll post that link in the show notes so you can go check it out, see how that kind of played out. Haley, you want to talk about where they can find you?
Yeah, I'm Haley H.Y. Gregor, hygregor.com, Tovia H.Y. on Instagram, H.Y. Gregor Author on Facebook. Yeah, you can contact me through my website. Pretty easy. Probably have a bio up on Book Career in a Year Network at some point. So yeah.
And a big special thank you to our guest, Jon Osborne.
With a lot from us this weekend, and we appreciate it.
And you can find me at jonrosborne.com, on Amazon under Jon R. Osborne, Facebook at Jon R. Osborne, Instagram at Jon R. Osborne, Twitter at Druid Oz, because it was before I started writing.
There it is.
I really need a bit.
It happens. Thank you guys again. If there's anything specific you'd like to see, again, like, comment, subscribe. Let us know via whatever way you're catching podcasts, because this podcast should go out everywhere you can get podcasts. And we'll see you next time.
Plancha.
And that was the end of part 2 of hashtag Bring On Beer, where Jon R. Osborne talked to us about urban fantasy and how he builds worlds when the world's almost pre-built. Thanks again to Book Career Network for hosting us. And again, thanks to you as the audience for stopping by. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Worlds Asunder. And as always, you can follow the whole cast of characters at the links in the show notes. You should tune in next week as we talk to Clark Rowanson about magic. Finally, make sure you subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, and go ahead and comment for us if you've got questions. And as always, thanks for helping us tear the worlds asunder. We'll see you next time.